Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love captivating stories about men transforming into women in unique and fascinating ways, then be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Now, let's jump right into today's tale.
Kristin stood at the kitchen counter, humming softly as she poured coffee, wearing nothing but Daniel's shirt and a tiny pair of underwear. The rich aroma of freshly ground beans filled the modern kitchen, mingling with the scent of the pastries they'd picked up from the bakery down the street. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the space in a golden glow that highlighted the elegant simplicity of Daniel's penthouse. The oversized fabric draped over her bare thighs. The sleeves rolled up as she moved, completely at ease in his home, in his space, in his life. The borrowed shirt bore his scent, a subtle reminder of their night together that sent pleasant shivers down her spine whenever she caught a whiff of it. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so comfortable, so naturally at home in someone else's space. Behind her, Daniel sat at the table, wearing only a pair of low-slung sweatpants, his arms folded, his gaze locked onto her. His hair was still slightly damp from the shower, tousled in that effortlessly attractive way that seemed impossible to replicate intentionally. The morning stubble on his jaw gave him a rugged edge that contrasted beautifully with the refined elegance of his home. She could feel his stare, hot, heavy, lingering. It was tangible, like a physical touch trailing along her exposed skin, raising goosebumps despite the warmth of the kitchen. His attention had a weight to it, an intensity that made her hyper-aware of every movement, every inch of exposed skin, every subtle shift of the borrowed shirt as she reached for mugs. And she had no intention of ignoring it. "You take 2 sugars, right?" she asked innocently, glancing over her shoulder with practiced nonchalance, as if she wasn't perfectly aware of the effect she was having on him. "Black is fine," he replied, his voice carrying a slight roughness that hadn't been there moments before. "Though I'm finding it hard to focus on coffee at the moment." Smirking to herself, she decided to put on a little show. A performance designed specifically for her audience of one, choreographed to drive him just to the edge of his control, without quite pushing him over. She stretched up on her toes, reaching for a plate in the cupboard, the hem of his shirt riding higher, exposing more of her bare legs. The motion was deliberate, drawn out, her back arching just enough to accentuate the curve of her figure beneath the thin fabric. "These cupboards are ridiculously high," she complained, though the smile in her voice belied any actual annoyance. "Do you ever actually use the top shelves?" "Not often," Daniel admitted, making no attempt to hide the appreciation in his tone. "Though I'm suddenly seeing the appeal of inconveniently placed dishware." Then, as she turned to grab the food, she did it slowly, swaying her hips just enough to make sure he noticed. Each movement was calculated for maximum impact, casual enough to maintain the pretense of innocence, deliberate enough to be unmistakably provocative. When she finally glanced back at him, her stomach flipped at the look in his eyes. Gone was the playful banter, replaced by something far more primal. His pupils had dilated, darkening his normally clear blue eyes to a stormy indigo. His posture had shifted subtly, more alert, more focused, more predatory. His expression was clouded, dark, full of heat. The casual relaxation from moments before had vanished, replaced by tension that was visible in the set of his shoulders, the flex of his forearms, the slight clench of his jaw. Desire. Raw, unfiltered, and directed entirely at her. And it sent a rush of pure need coursing through her veins. The power of knowing exactly how much she affected him was intoxicating, a heady cocktail of feminine confidence and primal satisfaction. This man, this successful, intelligent, confident man, reduced to barely restrained desire simply by her presence. "See something you like?" she asked, her voice deliberately light, though it carried an undertone that matched the heat in his gaze. "Everything," Daniel replied without hesitation, the single word loaded with meaning. Every single thing. For a brief, reckless moment, she considered forgetting breakfast entirely, dragging him back to bed, and losing herself in him again. The memory of his hands on her skin, his mouth against hers, the way he had touched her with equal parts reverence and hunger. It was almost enough to make her abandon all plans for the day. Almost. But she couldn't. She had to go to her grandmother's today. Their weekly magic lesson was non-negotiable. Especially now, when Gran was teaching her particularly complex protection spells that required precise timing and preparation. And showing up late, flushed and disheveled from a morning tryst, would only invite the kind of knowing looks and teasing comments her grandmother specialized in. With a deep breath, she forced herself to focus, breaking the spell as she placed the food and coffee on the table. The pastries, almond croissants, and pain au chocolat from the French bakery, Daniel swore by, looked delicious, though significantly less appetizing than the alternative activity her mind kept suggesting. Daniel exhaled, as if shaking himself from whatever trance she had put him in, and cleared his throat before asking, "So, what's on your agenda today?" His voice still carried that slightly rough edge, but he'd managed to regain some semblance of composure as he reached for his coffee. Kristin smirked as she took a sip of her own drink, appreciating the rich flavor that was worlds away from the basic brew Kyle used to make. "I have to go see my grandmother." She settled into the chair opposite him, crossing her legs in a way that caused his gaze to dip momentarily before returning to her face. The slight tightening around his eyes told her he was making a concerted effort to maintain eye contact, a struggle she found endlessly amusing and flattering. Daniel arched a brow, his lips twitching in amusement. "So, that's a no to going back to bed." "Responsibilities before pleasure," she replied, with mock seriousness, breaking off a piece of croissant. "Unfortunately." "Such dedication," he observed, watching as she deliberately licked a flake of pastry from her fingertip. "Your grandmother must be very important to you." "She is," Kristin acknowledged, her tone shifting to something more genuine. "Especially lately. We've gotten a lot closer in the past few months." Daniel nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his features. "You've mentioned her a few times. She sounds formidable." Kristin chuckled, shaking her head. "That's one word for her. Meddling and perceptive are a couple others that come to mind." "The best grandmothers usually are," Daniel replied with a smile. "Mine used to predict which girls I'd date in high school with terrifying accuracy. Said she could read the trouble in my eyes." "Was she right?" Kristin asked, genuinely curious about this glimpse into his younger years. "Every single time," he confirmed with a rueful laugh, "including the predictions about how each relationship would end. It was uncanny." But then, after a moment, his expression shifted, something almost hesitant, as if he was debating something. He took another sip of coffee, seemed to come to a decision, and set down his mug with deliberate care. Then, a little shyly, he said, "You think I could join you?" The question hung between them, carrying implications that went far beyond a simple social visit. Meeting family, even extended family, represented a step forward, an acknowledgement that whatever was happening between them had evolved beyond casual dating or physical attraction. Kristin blinked, slightly surprised. Not by the request itself, but by the timing. They'd only just crossed the boundary from flirtation to physical intimacy, and already he was suggesting meeting her family. It was unexpected, though not unwelcome. Daniel shrugged, suddenly looking a little unsure of himself, a rare glimpse of vulnerability beneath his usual confident exterior. "I wouldn't mind meeting the lady you talk about," he paused, then quickly backpedaled, misinterpreting her silence as reluctance. "But if it's too soon, we can wait." "It's okay." The brief flash of uncertainty tugged at something in her chest, a recognition that even Daniel Carter successful businessman and seemingly unshakable force of nature, had moments of doubt when it came to whatever was developing between them. Kristin didn't answer with words. Instead, she stood up, walked around the table, and straddled his lap, settling herself over him in the chair. The movement was smooth, confident, an answer more eloquent than any verbal response could have been. His shirt rode up as she positioned herself, the thin fabric of her underwear the only barrier between them, as she settled against him. Daniel's hands instinctively gripped her thighs, his breath hitching just slightly as she leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to his lips. His palms were warm against her skin, his touch both possessive and reverent, a contradiction that characterized so much of their interaction. When she pulled back, she met his gaze and murmured, "I would love for you to meet her." The simple statement carried weight, an acknowledgement that he wasn't just a passing fancy or a physical distraction, that whatever was happening between them mattered enough to incorporate into the other important aspects of her life. Daniel's expression softened, something like relief and pleasure mingling in his eyes. But before he could say anything, she shifted her weight deliberately against him, feeling his immediate physical response to her proximity. His breath hitched, his grip on her thighs tightening slightly. "Kristin," he warned, though there was no actual rebuke in his tone, just desire barely held in check. "We're supposed to be having breakfast." "I'm having breakfast," she replied innocently, reaching for her coffee cup and taking a deliberate sip without moving from his lap. "Aren't you?" "You're playing with fire," he informed her, his voice dropping to that lower register that never failed to send shivers down her spine. "Good thing I'm not afraid of getting burned," she countered, setting her cup aside and leaning in for another kiss. This one, deeper, more demanding, a clear statement of intent. Daniel responded immediately, one hand moving to the small of her back, the other sliding up to tangle in her hair. The kiss escalated quickly, the banked fires of their earlier exchange flaring back to full strength in seconds. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Daniel glanced at his watch. "What time do we need to be at your grandmother's?" 11, Kristin replied, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his bare chest, enjoying the way his muscles tensed beneath her touch. "It's only 8 now." "So we have time," he concluded, his expression shifting to something predatory that made her pulse quicken. "We have time," she agreed, her smile turning wicked. "The question is, what should we do with it?" "I have a few ideas," Daniel replied, his hands sliding beneath the borrowed shirt to trace the curve of her waist. "None of which involve finishing breakfast." "What a shame," Kristin sighed dramatically, even as she arched into his touch. "These pastries were quite expensive, I'm told." "I'll buy more," he promised, already standing up, lifting her effortlessly as she wrapped her legs around his waist. "Right now, I have more pressing priorities." As he carried her toward the bedroom, breakfast completely forgotten in favor of more immediate appetites, Kristin couldn't help but think that meeting her grandmother later would be all the more interesting after this particular morning activity. Gran, with her uncanny perception, would undoubtedly take one look at them and know exactly what they'd been doing. The thought should have been mortifying. Instead, Kristin found herself looking forward to introducing the two most significant people in her new life. But first, she had more immediate concerns to attend to. Specifically, the extremely attractive man, currently carrying her to his bedroom with delightfully wicked intentions. Breakfast, after all, could always be reheated. Kristin stood at the doorstep of her grandmother's house, her fingers hovering just inches from the door as a wave of unexpected nervousness settled in her stomach. The familiar white Victorian, with its wraparound porch and meticulously maintained garden, suddenly felt intimidating in a way it never had before. Even the cheerful wind chimes hanging from the eaves, which she now knew were actually subtle protective wards disguised as decorations, seemed to be tinkling with extra significance today. She wasn't sure why she felt this way. After all, she'd been coming here weekly for the past 2 months. This house had become her sanctuary, her classroom, her connection to a magical heritage she was only beginning to fully appreciate. The creaky porch steps, the faint scent of herbs that perpetually clung to the curtains, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. These were all comforting constants in her rapidly evolving life. Her grandmother had been the one to change her life in the first place. She had been nothing but supportive, guiding her through this new reality. Gran had been patient with her questions, firm when she needed direction, and unexpectedly gentle when the magnitude of the transformation occasionally overwhelmed her. She'd taught Kristin not just how to be a witch, but how to embrace the woman she had become. But introducing Daniel, that felt different. "You okay?" Daniel asked from behind her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The casual touch sent a ripple of warmth through her, a reminder of how they'd spent their morning before finally leaving his apartment, barely making it on time for their appointment with Gran. "Fine," Kristin replied, offering him a reassuring smile that didn't quite mask her anxiety. "Just giving you one last chance to back out. My grandmother can be intense." Daniel chuckled, the sound low and warm in the crisp autumn air. "After all the stories you've told me, I'm expecting a cross between Yoda and Miranda Priestley, with a dash of fortune teller thrown in." He squeezed her waist gently. "I think I can handle it." His confidence was both reassuring and concerning. He had no idea what he was walking into. Not really. How could he possibly understand that the elderly woman behind this door had literally transformed reality with a spell? That she could probably turn him into a toad if he said the wrong thing. It wasn't just about showing up with a man, it was about him. Daniel wasn't some casual date or convenient distraction. In the whirlwind of the past few weeks, he had become something far more significant, a fixture in her thoughts, a constant in her days, a presence that she found herself increasingly unwilling to imagine doing without. Daniel was important to her. The realization wasn't new, but its weight seemed to increase with each passing day. Every shared laugh, every heated argument about design aesthetics, every charged glance across a conference table, all of it added to the growing certainty that what she'd found with him was rare and worth protecting. Hell, he was already becoming everything to her, which was terrifying in its own right. Kyle had never been particularly successful at relationships, maintaining a series of lukewarm connections that inevitably fizzled out from lack of genuine engagement. But Kristin felt things differently, more deeply, more intensely, especially when it came to Daniel. And for some reason, she found herself worrying about what her grandmother would say. Would she approve? Would she tease her endlessly? Would she? Kristin didn't even get to knock. The door swung open abruptly, as if her grandmother had been standing just on the other side waiting. Knowing Gran, she probably had been, either through magical means or simple familiarity with Kristin's habitual hesitation before knocking. Her grandmother stood there, looking distinctly stressed, her brows furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if something had been troubling her before they arrived. The expression was unusual. Gran typically maintained an air of serene confidence, regardless of circumstances. The silver-haired woman was dressed in her usual elegant casual attire, a flowing tunic over tailored pants, accented with several pieces of antique jewelry that Kristin now recognized as magical artifacts disguised as fashion accessories. "You're late," Gran stated, though her tone lacked its usual admonishing edge. Something else had her attention, something more significant than Kristin's punctuality, or lack thereof. But then, just as quickly, her sharp gaze flicked over Kristin and Daniel. And just like that, the stress vanished, replaced by something much more amused. A slow, knowing smirk, curled her lips as she looked Daniel up and down, taking in his casual but expensive attire. His confident posture, the hand that still rested possessively on Kristin's waist. Then she turned to Kristin with a mischievous glint in her eyes. That particular sparkle that always preceded either brilliance or trouble, and often both simultaneously. "Well," she murmured, almost to herself, "this explains quite a bit." "Well, well, well," her grandmother mused, crossing her arms in a gesture Kristin knew all too well. "Grands, I know something you don't know pose. Kristin, you do have exquisite taste in men." The compliment was unexpected. Gran wasn't typically effusive with praise, especially regarding Kristin's personal choices. There was something in her tone, something beyond simple approval, that sent a tingle of warning down Kristin's spine. Kristin blinked, caught off guard. Her grandmother ignored her, shifting her gaze back to Daniel, subjecting him to another appraising once over that was decidedly more evaluative than social politeness would dictate. When she spoke again, her voice carried a hint of satisfaction, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "You even managed to bag a warlock." Then, as if she had just dropped the most casual bombshell in the world, she turned and retreated into the living room, her flowing tunic billowing slightly behind her like a royal train. Kristin was left completely frozen, in place, her brain suddenly unable to process simple motor commands, like close your mouth or blink occasionally. Processing. Kristin's brain short-circuited. She just, what? Her mouth opened, but nothing came out, because she was still trying to figure out if she had actually heard that correctly, or if her grandmother had finally lost it. The words seemed to bounce around in her head, refusing to settle into any coherent meaning. Her grandmother had just called Daniel a warlock. As in, a male witch. As in, a magical practitioner. As in, someone with powers similar to what she herself had been learning these past months. The implications were staggering, creating a cascade of questions that threatened to overwhelm her already short-circuiting cognitive functions. If Daniel was magical, did he know about her transformation? Had he recognized something in her? Had he been drawn to her because of their shared magical nature? How long had he known? Why hadn't he said anything? "Aren't you two coming in?" Her grandmother called from inside, her voice carrying that infuriating note of amusement. "The tea's getting cold and we have quite a bit to discuss." Kristin remained rooted to the spot, her mind still reeling. She turned to Daniel, expecting him to look just as confused as she was, to laugh it off, to ask what her grandmother was talking about, to display any normal reaction to being unexpectedly labeled a practitioner of the magical arts. Instead, he looked nervous. Not confused, not amused, not bewildered, nervous. His usual confident demeanor had faltered, replaced by something more hesitant, more wary. One hand rubbed the back of his neck. A tell she'd noticed emerged only when he was genuinely uncomfortable. His shoulders had tensed slightly, and he wasn't quite meeting her eyes. It was the look of someone who had just been caught in a secret they had hoped to keep. Kristin narrowed her eyes, suspicion crystallizing into certainty. "Daniel, diet?" He ran a hand through his hair, sighing in resignation. "Yeah, I need to explain this." The confirmation sent a jolt through her system, a cocktail of shock, betrayal, and oddly, relief. At least she wasn't imagining things. At least her grandmother hadn't completely lost her mind. At least there was an explanation for whatever was happening. "You're damn right you do," she replied, her voice low but intense. "Starting with whether or not my grandmother just called you a warlock, and why you're not laughing it off as the ravings of an eccentric old woman." "I heard that," Gran called from inside. "And I'm neither eccentric nor particularly old. Thank you very much. Magical bloodlines tend toward longevity." Before she could demand, he explained immediately, right there on the porch. Daniel grabbed her gently but firmly by the arm and led her inside. His touch was careful but insistent, A clear message that this wasn't a conversation to be had in public view. "Inside," he murmured, his voice carrying an authority she hadn't heard from him before. "This isn't for the neighbors to overhear." Kristin let herself be pulled forward, her mind racing. The familiar entry hall of her grandmother's house seemed suddenly alien, as if she were seeing it through entirely new eyes. The subtle protective symbols carved into the doorframe, the strategically placed mirrors that Gran had explained, were for redirecting energies. The crystals embedded in the chandelier that caught and dispersed light in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, all of it took on new significance. Because suddenly, this wasn't just a meeting with her grandmother anymore. This was something else entirely. A convergence of magical worlds she hadn't known existed separately, let alone together. A revelation that suggested the man she'd been falling for had secrets as significant as her own. A moment that threatened to upend everything she thought she knew about her new reality. And she had a feeling her life was about to change all over again. As Daniel guided her into the living room, where her grandmother waited, teacups already arranged on the coffee table as if she'd been expecting this exact scenario, Kristin couldn't decide whether to feel furious, betrayed, or eerily validated by the bizarre turn of events. All she knew for certain was that explanations were owed, and she intended to get them.